Welcome to this retrospective slash review for Final Fantasy IV 3D Remake. And I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things I did to set it up and get it working under Linux, as well as just my thoughts on the game, both the positives and the negatives. And so go ahead and just jump right on in. So basically, for starters, getting this game working on Linux very easy. Steam nowadays, it just works. A lot of the games just work like right out of the box. Having said that, this game did have an issue, and I didn't notice it at first because like this video that you see running here in the background, for instance, sounded fine. Everything sounded great. Um, but I was using the latest version of Proton, which at the time of this recording was 7.0-2. But when I actually fired up the game, there's no music. And and if you know anything about playing any Final Fantasy games, a Final Fantasy game without music is just, well, not a Final Fantasy game. It's not the same thing. The music is arguably one of the defining factors of a Final Fantasy game. So anyway, I had to do a little bit of looking online. In fact, I even went to the older version of Proton that I used for Final Fantasy III, thinking, well, maybe that'll work because Final Fantasy III worked just fine with the Proton 6 version that I was running, but it also had no music. And the weird thing is, other than say this cutscene at the beginning, speech was working just fine. It was just there was no music, and I think even some of the sound effects weren't coming through the game. So it was kind of starting to be a little bit disheartening. But I found out if you go all the way back to Proton 4.11-13, well, as you've seen with all the videos, or may have seen with some of the videos that I've posted here, it works perfectly, flawlessly, music and everything. So yeah, right now at this point in time, in early 2022, if you want to play Final Fantasy IV under Linux, you need to fire up, go in there, change compatibility, and use Proton 4.11-13. It shouldn't have any issues whatsoever. But now, let's get to the game itself. So I did look at a couple of reviews online on Steam, and there seemed to be, I don't know, I would say probably overwhelmingly positive, but there were also a lot of negative reviews about the game as well. And the things that they were negative on were just things that I don't think I would agree with. Personally, for me, I initially thought I was going to have an issue with, well, the art style of the game, since when I played this originally back in the day, I played on the Super Nintendo. So I was kind of a little partial to that art style, to say the least. But, once I got into the game and started playing it, I actually am okay with the art style, and it didn't really detract at all. Um, so I think the art style of the game is actually pretty good. It it's really not too cutesy, with the exception of say the twins, because well, the twins are kind of like that. They're a little cutesy. They kind of look like chipmunks to a certain extent. But the other than that, I think, well, it looks good. A little pixelated, not pixelated, polygonal looking, because it is a little more blocky, because originally this was a DS game, and the DS was just basically a portable version of the Nintendo 64. So Nintendo 64 is also known for its very polygonal looking graphics. So I mean, it does kind of have that style to it to a certain extent, but I don't mind it. It looks just fine to me, and the enemy models are pretty great. Um, for the most part, the user interface, it works very well as for me. There was sometimes, and this really only happened when you had Kane in the party. So with Kane in the party, you want to use his jump ability a lot of times, but sometimes doing that, the UI is just kind of lags a little bit, and like when you try to target everybody, it might just end up targeting one person. And obviously, towards the end of the game, that was more predominant of an issue because Kane's in your party at the end of the game. So other than that, the UI worked pretty good. I mean, it seemed a little sluggish at times, but it wasn't anything that I thought detracted too much from the game. And that, speaking of sluggishness, that's one of the other main criticisms a lot of people online have with it. They were saying that basically the old 2D version of the game was basically just the combat was a lot faster. So with all the different frames of animation and whatnot, in this version, it's slower. So I can understand that to a certain extent when people are saying that, but also I don't think I don't know. I think the extra frames of animation not actually a bad thing in my opinion. I think it works. It looks good. I mean, yes, the older game is faster because it was a 2D game, but I don't know. I think that's probably nitpicking and quibbling over something that shouldn't get a thumbs down on Steam, in my opinion. If that's your cup of tea, you may be more interested in the Pixel remaster compared to the 3D version, but it didn't bother me in the slightest. Now, I will say that the summon animations were they were pretty detailed, to be honest, especially and that did surprise me to a certain extent because I don't remember the summons in Final Fantasy 3 being nearly as cinematic, I guess would be the best way of describing it. But the animations in this one were much more cinematic than any of the stuff that happened in 3 for sure. So it's but having said that, you could, as soon as Rydia, excuse me, went to start casting a summon spell, you could just hit the A button to basically just cancel out the actual animation itself. So not that big of a deal. And honestly, I thought the actual summons looked really awesome, which is kind of something that I don't never remembered playing with any of the Final Fantasies until Final Fantasy VII came out. But to be fair, I had only played Final Fantasy One and, as we knew it, two prior to Final Fantasy VII coming out. I haven't played a lot of Final Fantasy games, so for me, I think the animations were actually pretty dang awesome. So that's a minor point. Let's see, what else can I talk about? I mean, well, obviously the music. Uh, Very rarely I saw some people make comments that the soundtrack was much better on the Super Nintendo, and maybe that's true. But at the same time, the soundtrack was actually very faithful to what I remember. Now, I might notice more of a difference if I had just played the Super Nintendo version recently and I could actually compare the two soundtracks. But as far as I could tell, to my memory and whatnot, this is a very faithful adaptation of the soundtrack. So I think it was a great job there as well. I mean, it sounds like I'm praising this game nonstop because, well, I mean, it's one of my favorite Final Fantasies, and I think they did a really good job on it. Um, Battle system worked great. The story was absolutely faithful. They didn't change anything, and for me, yeah, nostalgia does play a little bit of a role here, but at the same time, it was the first Final Fantasy that I ever played that actually had had a good story, and that was just something like the original Final Fantasy. Even though I thought it was a good game, it wasn't something that had a great storyline. This was the first RPG I ever played personally, where things had a much bigger stakes as far as the storyline was concerned, and there's lots of twists and turns all throughout the story. It is interesting that in hindsight how quick it was to play through this game because I seem to remember it being longer, but it actually, other than me doing all the side quest stuff, it actually was a pretty quick game if you were to just go from start to finish. It actually doesn't take that long of time to do that. Other than that, I mean, there's not a lot of negatives I can think of, other than kind of what I'm doing right now. So if you're a completionist, basically there are a handful of achievements. I got, I think, 48 out of 58 with my playthrough. And some of those achievements are, they're basically tied to random drops. So, like, the reason why I'm doing what you're seeing right now, and that's kind of why I wanted to fire it up like this, is because to get some of these achievements, you've got like literally, even with a treasure hunter augment, you've got like a 2% chance for this drop to fall from this creature, for instance. And this pink flan, they basically they drop one of two um, drops that you need to get. One is the rainbow pudding for the naming way quest, just so you can actually continue the quest line. And it's funny because like online they say, well, you could just go to the antlion den and you could get it there. But even with a treasure hunter, your drop rate is 0.8%, whereas it's so much higher here at 2% with this particular monster. So it's kind of ridiculous that there are achievements tied to these extremely low drop rates. If you don't care about getting all the achievements in the game, that may not bother you. It does bother me though, and I can understand why some people would definitely criticize it for the fact that I'm sitting here trying to get some of the 2% drop rate, and that's not even the only thing they drop. They drop the rainbow pudding and the pink tail. And I've literally come to this area and spent quite a few hours just doing what you see me doing right now, trying to get a drop. And obviously, I haven't got it yet. And that's something that I really wish they wouldn't do. I mean, is this as bad as the Final Fantasy III final achievement? That remains to be seen, because the Final Fantasy III achievement, I had to get max levels at all the jobs for each character in Final Fantasy III, and that took forever. So, I mean, I just sit here and maybe watch some YouTube videos or something while I just went grinding in that game. But I mean, that took, I can't even begin to tell you how many hours I put into Final Fantasy III just to get one achievement. And so for this one, I'm trying to get about 10 achievements with an extremely low drop rate. And you see there, I got an elixir. Yay, great. I mean, that is kind of nice actually, but in this instance, I kind of want one of two specific drops, and then there's just other rare drops that you've got to get, and it's so weird. I mean, you don't have a very good chance of getting any of them until basically the end of the game. So that is something I think you could easily criticize the game on. So definitely not a perfect game from that perspective. Um, Now I played, for the most part, I played on hard mode difficulty, which would be basically the difficulty that the game had when it came out originally on DS, and the DS game basically restored the original difficulty, because apparently the version that we got in America initially was easy, so they had dropped the difficulty down for us. So I played on hard difficulty, and they also have two. Stupid bug. They have two ways of doing the active time battle. So for me, on the Super Nintendo, they had active time battle, but they introduced this one called wait, and the wait would be, I guess, the easier way of doing it. So it is more of a turn-based RPG at that point, because it's not going to, the monsters aren't just going to keep attacking you while you're sitting there trying to come up with the formulating what you want to do. But they both have their pros and cons. I mean, active time battle, the nice thing about that is you can actually skip somebody, and you can, this bug. Anyway, you can skip somebody and change the order of how everything goes. So I think that's actually, in my opinion, the active time battle is not only more faithful, but it also can be more beneficial to you from a strategic point of view. So that's really neat that you have those two options, as well as the two difficulty options for people who don't want to play on hard mode. But I didn't really find hard mode to be too frustrating, with one exception. And the exception would be there in the Dwarven Castle when you were fighting the dolls, and then right after that followed up with the Golbez fight. That was the only time I had to turn off active time battle and go to the wait system, and it made a huge difference there. But outside of that one battle, I stuck to using active time battle pretty much the entire game, except for a small period of time where I kind of forgot to turn it back on after that battle. So I think that was the way I prefer to play it. But you may not want to have to deal with that, and if that's the case, it gives you the option, and I like that. The options for people who want to play the game differently. I'd also talk about the voice acting. The voice acting in this game, I'm kind of used to like games from the '90s and whatnot, where the voice acting was pretty cheesy. And to be honest, almost all of the characters here, the voice acting was actually pretty dang good. I can't actually knock the voice acting at all. So I'd say they even did a very good job on voice acting. So overall, this is just a great game. Now, this game is still available on Steam. They have two versions of Final Fantasy IV. You can get this version, or you can get the Pixel Remaster, which just came out, I think, at the tail end of last year. I think it was out before this year started. Either way, it's a fairly recent addition to Steam, and they're comparatively priced about the same. The Pixel Remaster is $2 more at about $18 compared to, is it 18? Yeah, I think it's about $18, so about $3 more actually, because I think this one goes for about $15 on Steam. So $2-3 difference. I might have my numbers off a little bit there, but that's basically the difference in price. So you'd actually pay more for the 2D version than you would the 3D version. So at this point, if you've never played Final Fantasy IV, I can't. I Yeah, nostalgia plays a little bit of a factor in it, but I think it's a great game. The storyline still holds up to this day. There are definitely a lot of twists and turns, and there's that little sad moment with the two twins, which fortunately that towards the end they kind of fixed that. So I'm really happy about it. Unlike say Final Fantasy VII, where the sad moment in that game never really there is no there's no fixing the sad moment in Final Fantasy VII. At least, I mean, there was always rumors about that back in the day, but it never came out to be the truth. There are a couple of semi sad moments in this game, but at the end of the day, I think this story is a little more lighthearted than say some of the later Final Fantasies. But it's also at the same time, it does feel like there are some pretty big stakes going on. And I just like the storyline. So I would definitely highly recommend Final Fantasy IV to people who've never played it. And if you did play it back on the Super Nintendo when it originally came out, I can't recommend enough giving at least one of these two versions a try. I personally am happy with the fact that I bought the 3D remake version, but I could understand if someone would rather have the slightly faster paced combat of the Pixel remaster. But having said that, I don't think there's any reason why you should criticize this game for having a different play style with more animations and whatnot that comes from obviously a somewhat technically superior game. So I think that they're both good copies. Personally, I would give this one probably about a 90% ranking, because there are a lot of achievements that are tied to some really bad mechanics. And I'm not a big fan of achievements that are based off of very, very small um, drop chances. And The other big negative I would highlight is the fact that the UI is a bit wonky with Kane in the party, with him jumping around, and that can sometimes cause you to misclick things, and it can be a little bit frustrating. But overall, the game is just absolutely great. I'd say probably about a 90%. It's not perfect, and obviously it's not the greatest looking game in the world, but the graphics get the job done. So anyway, that'll do it for this video. I want to thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Take care. I'm going to kill these freaking slimes.